Good morning. My name is Abhirami Kirapanathi, and I am joined today by Bridget Waddingham, Nikolon Dudnath, Smit Patel, and Marcus Junwei Wong. And we are members of the Return to Office Implementation Committee within Employment and Social Development Canada. Next slide, please. As you're aware, the Treasury Board Secretariat has asked departments to implement these two directives, one on appropriate social media use and one on return to office. The Social Media Directive, effective March 1st, proposes public servants who protest for or against these directives on social media will face disciplinary action. It also puts into force monitoring public servant use of social media. The Return to Office Directive proposes 4 days a week, effective June 1st, pending an in-depth review from departments that will indicate which positions will be in office, virtual, or hybrid. We're going to start with our analysis and recommendation on Directive 2 with return to office, because that is the core issue. Next slide, please. So our objective today is to provide recommendations on how to implement the return to office and social media directives. Our recommendation embodies the values and principles of an ethical, modern public service. An ethical, modern public service is built on a culture of trust, respect, and public service values, but is flexible to adapt to contemporary and future needs. That culture creates the conditions to fulfill the primary goal and responsibility of the federal public service, which is delivering service excellence to Canadians. Next slide, please. Successful service excellence has to be based on getting the right people assigned to the right tasks. That should determine where and how they work. We call this approach right people, right place, and right task. Adhering to these basic principles will inform our approach to implementing the Return to Office Directive. Next slide, please. Implementing these directives is going to be a challenge at ESDC because morale and trust is at a low, in part because of the failures of previous attempts at return to office, which were poorly designed and implemented and inconsistent with the values and ethics code for the public sector. And our recommendation isn't going to repeat those mistakes. In addition, we have three main factors that further complicate the implementation and are unique to our department. The first is a young workforce that has different expectations than a typical government workforce. They expect hybrid and flexible work arrangements. The second is a significant growth of employees since the pandemic, despite the lack of office space to accommodate them. And when they are in office, it's crowded and many don't have assigned workspaces. In fact, many of these new hires are on term contracts and may have never worked physically in office. They may have missed onboarding, collaboration, mentorship, and socialization. So they haven't been integrated into the values and ethics of public service culture. Third is that the environment in which this is happening is in a perception of austerity where the public service is cutting back on the workforce, with more cuts to be expected. So these recent hires or contract employees, they're feeling vulnerable and devalued. They're worried about losing their jobs. All of this suggests our workforce is under considerable stress and anxiety, and trust is broken down between the management and the rank and file. Next slide, please. In addition to the issues we have mentioned, these directives compound the existing challenges at ESDC. They are extremely challenging to implement given the aggressive timeframe beginning March 1st. There is a lack of meaningful consultation, unlike in the past where unions have signed off on previous return to office directives. And finally, this was prescribed top-down, so the 4-day proposal will likely be seen as an arbitrary number. And that is how we conceive the basic problem here with ESDC's current situation and the risk of these directives exacerbating the problem. Next slide, please.
The proposed return to office directive is intended to reinforce the common hybrid work model policy. At ESDC, the implementation of this policy has failed. Treasury Board Secretariat flagged our department for critical noncompliance of below 60% in December 2024. The Common Hybrid Work Model policy establishes the value of hybrid work in the future of the federal public service, blending the strengths of in-person collaboration with the benefits of remote work. It is non-prescriptive, but provides a guideline that hybrid workers should spend 40 to 60% of their regular work time in office. It lacks a framework for implementation, resulting in inconsistent application across departments. The first attempt to reinforce this policy, undertaken last year, not only failed in achieving compliance, but also led to numerous unintended and unforeseen consequences, including public protests against senior leadership and government policy. In particular, many ESDC staff have expressed inappropriate comments about the competence of executives and ministerial staff on social media, angering our minister. Our committee views the failure of this directive as a result of taking the wrong approach to implementing hybrid policy. It lacked recognition of the purpose of hybrid work, which is to create autonomy for people to determine which tasks are best completed in what place. It suggested a lack of trust in employees, many of whom, including at ESDC, felt that they'd worked efficiently and diligently throughout the pandemic. Next slide, please. As we've discussed, the way that we've been going about this in the Canadian Federal Public Service has not been working. In contrast, the approach of the Australian Public Service has been very successful. The Australian Public Service has embedded hybrid work into their employment model. They offer flexibility in where and when work tasks are completed for all roles wherever possible. The parameters of work flexibility are determined on an individual basis, with direct supervisors to meet team requirements and match work tasks. The Australian model conforms to best practices for return to office, maintaining autonomy through flexibility, which reinforces trust and avoids misunderstandings that in-office time is intended to surveil employees. It seeks to ideally match task to location, a major benefit of hybrid work, where concentration tasks can be completed without the distraction at home, and collaboration can occur face-to-face. The future of ethical modern workplaces includes well-designed hybrid work. Hybrid models designed and implemented well can benefit the employee, the employer, and society more broadly. In fact, it's a key tool to attract and retain talent, feasible even in austerity. Our committee recommends embedding hybrid work into ESDC's employment model, consistent with Australia's approach and the intention of Canada's own common hybrid work model policy. We propose building off the key strengths of the Australian model to guide ESDC's approach in implementing our return to office directive. We'll do this by determining work location at the direct report level in an individualized, flexible manner, matching task to location. Next slide, please. Treasury Board Secretariat's directive proposes that public servants are in office 4 days a week, pending an in-depth review of all positions to designate which are required to be in-person, hybrid, or virtual. Each department is to undertake their own review to determine these designations. Building on the Australian model, at ESDC, we recommend that these designations are determined at the direct report level. This level of management understands the job best, such that they can match the work location to the work task of each individual worker. In other words, they can ensure that there are the right people in the right places to accomplish the right tasks and ultimately deliver service excellence to Canadians. Next slide, please. We recommend that on March 1st, the Deputy Minister announce our approach. Over the next 30 days, the direct managers will work with employees to designate each position as in-office, hybrid, or virtual. In the following month, individualized, flexible work plans will be built for each employee, within the office attendance guidelines of their designation. This work plan will include when and where work tasks are completed. By June 1st, each employee will have an individualized, flexible work plan, which can adapt over time. We realize that this is an aggressive time frame, but we've established this timeline in accordance with Treasury Board Secretariat's proposed directive. Shifting to a highly devolved model will be complex, and as such, it will be very challenging to achieve ideal implementation in a short time. It will take time to build the skill and capacity at all levels to ideally match work task to work location. Next slide, please.
An alternative option is the use of a top-down approach driven by regional director generals and director generals as opposed to the previous model that has a bottom-up approach. Under this model, as distinct from the preferred approach, senior management such as director general will make recommendations on which types of positions are in office, hybrid, or virtual designations to a committee of assistant deputy ministers who will make the final decisions. One of the strengths of this approach is that it can be applied consistently throughout the public service. But the main strength of this approach is that we think it can meet the aggressive timeline of the Treasury Board Secretariat. The weakness is that we lose that task-driven approach which maximizes service excellence to the public and builds a modern workplace culture. Next slide, please. As you would recall, some ESDC employees were making inappropriate comments on social media, criticizing the government's implementation of return to office. Our recommendation on return to office is designed to limit that risk because it is a bottom-up approach and engages the employee. This reinforces trust at the manager-employee level and improves morale. However, we believe not all ESDC employees understand or are aware of the department's code of conduct on appropriate use of social media. So that's why we're proposing a mandatory values and ethics training that focuses on the appropriate use of social media. 2 courses already exist at the Canada School of Public Service for management and non-management. We propose using those courses in the short run to meet the Treasury Board Secretariat's deadline. Furthermore, our assessment is that at least in the short to medium term, it would be infeasible to monitor 39,000 ESDC employees for appropriate use of social media. It would be labor-intensive, costly, and relying on technology that we don't have. Also, there's a high likelihood it would be met with vigorous employee and union resistance, and in addition to that, it could possibly violate the charter right on the freedom of expression. Instead, we are proposing prohibiting employees from accessing personal social media accounts on government-owned devices, which is in keeping with the intent of the directive. Our recommendation matches the minister's intent to limit the inappropriate use of social media, which was outlined in the case. Next slide, please.
Committee was also asked to comment on whether changes are needed to the Values and Ethics Code for the public sector. And in our analysis, the code is sound and reflects the modern public service workplace. We also find that the ESDC Code of Conduct is in conformity with the Values and Ethics Code. So we do not recommend that ESDC seek any amendments to the public service ethical framework. However, the government's approach to return to office could be interpreted as being in conflict with the spirit and the letter of the Values and Ethics Code, as well as the ESDC's Code of Conduct. And this misalignment also applies to the 2 proposed TBS directives in our view. And so our recommendations are aimed at implementing the directives to bring them into conformity with the Values and Ethics Code and the ESDC Code of Conduct. And we believe that our recommended approach will produce a better functioning organization because it will repair trust and build respect at the managerial level, which will lead to better service for Canadians. But what does this theoretical framework look like in practice? Next slide, please. So here's an example of how our model, right people, right place, right task, can work in practice. Take the example of the minister's laudable goal to strengthen local engagement of ESTC staff across the country. Instead of hiring regional employment advisors in Ottawa and deploying them across the country, we give hiring preference to people from the communities, which are the right people. And we do this because these people have the local knowledge and the local connections, and they're already in place. They're the right people for the right task, which is a locally based task. And so, the right task. And on that note, the local or regional manager then determines whether the task and position requires to be in office, hybrid, or remote. And that determines the right place. The outcome is improved service to Canadians, greater local engagement, and it brings ESTC closer to the people. Next slide, please.
You will recall that our primary objective is improving service to Canadians. To get there, we need an ethical, modern public service built on trust, respect, and flexibility. Our preferred approach to return to office is bottom up, and this repairs and builds the culture of trust between senior management and employees. It is also a contemporary and more flexible approach to employee relations. And our model isn't theoretical. It's based on best practices and has been successfully implemented in Australia. And we've shown you with a real-world relevant example with how it'll work in our department. By implementing our recommendation, ESDC will deliver excellent service to Canadians. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. My name is Noah Morris. I'm the head judge in the SDC, and I want to thank you very much for your work, for your comprehensive and very detailed presentation. I know it's hard to connect on the weekend, and I know all the hard work you've done. So I want to thank you all for your wonderful work. I learned a lot, and I learned a lot from all these presentations. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Nancy, to ask a question related to your presentation.
Thank you very much. You, in the presentation, identified, I think the wording that you used initially was sort of focusing on the core issue around return to office, and then segued into the second directive from Treasury Board on social media. And I'm just interested in taking maybe a little bit deeper dive into the nexus that you contemplated around these two directives, and maybe some of the risks and considerations that you were thinking through in coming up with the recommendations that you've presented.
Yeah, so I think that understanding that nexus was really essential to how we went about breaking down the case. To us, the problem that gives rise to the need for that directive on social media is really a symptom of the failure in implementation in earlier versions of the return to work policy. So that previous directive on prescribed presence, that top-down, highly prescriptive manner, it builds to the psychology of an employee base that feels they're not being respected for the work they have put in. And there's a wide range of employees within any organization, but to approach it in such a top-down manner with very little consultation, particularly when that initial common hybrid work model policy had consultation with the bargaining agents, et cetera, it reinforced this really negative morale. And then it gives rise to people airing their frustrations. Now, I think the other important nexus that does exist is the fact that when we've had such a huge growth, right, over just a few years, from 27,000 to 39,000 employees, So many of those employees, because they either have never been in the office or they've only been in the office in a limited way, and because, as the case tells us, this employee group is so young, they haven't necessarily been well integrated into the culture and values of the public service. And so I think that piece of being able to teach those values and ensure that we get the positives in the socialization, in the mentorship that will help those values be established is really the biggest tools we can use to combat social media, so that we don't have this really just infeasible, but also very consequential idea of monitoring everybody's individual social media use.
Thank you so much for that feedback. I'm wondering if I can also jump into a question around slide 8. I'm very appreciative that you have 2 different recommendations, one focused on the direct report, make the direct manager making the determination on right people, right place, right task, versus the other recommendation kind of grouping that at a higher level and getting the ADM team to do some vetting. I mean, obviously these determinations are going to be very consequential for all of the individuals, and I'm just wondering, you know, the unions are going to be actively engaged in supporting their members. And so, again, interested in maybe a little bit deeper dive on how you would be helping the local manager to ensure consistency over, you know, we're a big department, you know, 40,000 folks. And, you know, those individual determinations could really be impactful for us at a departmental level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important and an excellent question. So I think that this comes down to ensuring that people have the framework and the guidelines that they need to understand how those determinations should be made. And this kind of speaks to the implementation pathway that we go through that they presented on the timeline, which is really that we would introduce this measure, be able to provide the framework, just like the Australian Public Service does, right? So it's really clearly communicated what the purpose is, which is to have the benefits of in-person work, right? So instead of directives that are prescriptive and say, you need to be in office this many days a week, this says you need to be in office because we need the mentorship, we need the collaboration, we need the teamwork, we need the socialization, we need all these positive things. And let's figure out how we can ensure that that is what's actually happening in office, rather than essentially just mimicking online work, but showing up in office and making employees feel that it is punitive or that they're being surveilled, right? Or surveyed. So instead, you are able to, that direct report level, they really understand what their team needs. And so along the framework of our policy, that's that first step, right? They figure out what the needs are of their team. And for example, whether they would be in for core hours during the day, or if there would be anchor days during the week, which is along the lines of the Australian policy, where everybody is there and you actually have the time to collaborate. We realize that there's these limitations in this enormous department in ESDC that mean that there can't be co-located spaces for all teams if they're all there all the time. So by having that shaped in that manner, we can really have a better institutional practice where you can follow that goal of the space reduction, but make sure that those core activities that are what makes in-person work face-to-face so valuable actually occur. And that starts from the bottom. It starts from having the people who really understand those tasks and understand where they need to be done, inform which people are where, when, doing what.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to my my ESDC colleague, Guy Giorno, to talk about some of the trade-offs around working conditions in the employer.
Yes, thank you so much. I get that the point that the more consultation there is, the more employees buy in, the more they understand, the less likely they will be to turn to social media to be critical. And I also get that it may be impractical to attempt to monitor personal use, but the directive has been worded broadly, in part because it's been accepted and understood that Canadians have a right to a public service that will implement policies neutrally and loyally. And the directive is not limited to return to office. And the directive is, one could argue, intentionally covering both government devices and personal devices, because neutrality and loyalty are compromised if somebody on personal time on a personal device criticizes a policy or program. Could be employment insurance, could be anything that's supposed to be neutrally and loyally implemented. Did you want to just comment on how you've struck the balance, because your balance appears to be, as I hear you, everything on personal devices okay, and it's only government devices we should be concerned about. Did I get that correctly?
Okay, I can speak to that as well. So if we actually, I'm not sure if we should flip to the directive or perhaps, let's do that. Flip to slide 2 if you would. Or does anybody know which number slide? Sorry for the social media.
Slide 12, I think, talks about our recommendation on how to implement that directive.
Right. And in that directive, when we did flip back to it, it does identify federal assets in particular in the writing of the directive, right? So that was why we commented on federal assets in particular, because we do think it's important to make the distinction that when you're using the property of the government, there are some clear restrictions around that. That's intended for work. It's not meant for personal social media use. And that's really why we make that distinction, right? Is that this should be, essentially this directive shouldn't even come into play on government devices, because you shouldn't be doing personal social media use on those devices. But why we have the two-prong approach is because certainly, as you say, it is essential to recognize that those sorts of comments are really damaging, regardless of when they happen or what device that they happen on. I think that the approach we take is really to say that, one, the process and the culture is fundamental to ensuring that we're reinforcing the values, and two, that we also actively work to teach people what those things are. So we do think that there's a gap and it's a generational gap as well, where people are not necessarily aware of this values and ethics code, and not necessarily aware of how that connects to what they say. The idea of sort of the public forum and the personal forum are very difficult to split in an online context on social media. The line of where you post on Facebook to your private friends versus having conversation at dinner and where it's public are difficult concepts for people to understand. So if we teach them about the duty of loyalty, about neutrality, about impartiality, and what their obligations are as a public servant, we think that most employees are going to then be able to, especially with that explicit link to what that looks like on social media, are going to act better in how they communicate online. In addition to that, with that training done, it doesn't allow for sort of any excuses that people don't understand inappropriate comments on social media. So if they need to proceed through we don't object to the wording. I think it's employment. Sorry, somebody can get the exact wording for me, but a punitive process essentially. We can reinforce that we've made them do this training. They are well aware of their actions. They understand the implications. And so in a labor relations context that is really difficult in the public service, we can demonstrate that we've shown them what the right actions are and what they needed to be doing on social media, and they're in violation of that.
And to add on to Bridget's point, like, we understand that there's a fine balance between, the use of social media on like your personal devices and your government-owned devices. But we just thought that, with the current morale or the current declining trust in morale at ESD, like this directive, as Bridget said, being punitive and possibly, having that opening up that resistance to, the violation of charter rights on expression would further exacerbate the current issue. The intent of the directive is to limit inappropriate use of social media, and that's the minister's intent as well. And so we feel like there's a better approach that limits that risk that the current directive is initially proposing. So as she said, like the values and ethics training, it's going to be integrated into the life of a public servant, especially those new hires or those who were hired since the pandemic who really didn't have that initial onboarding where they were able to like really talk through these ideas, these concepts with their managers. And I feel like also with this approach, since we're allowing more of a bottom up where managers and employees or their direct report actually are having those conversations, it'll allow more opportunities, we feel, to be able to go into those deeper so that public servants are aware, because it is in the ESDC's code of conduct.
Okay, so I'm going to
Sorry.
call it there. Thank you
Thank you.
so much, team, for your advice.